There were no cameras, no microphones, no live stream, but inside that Manhattan courtroom, history was being written, word by word, under oath. What we're about to walk through isn't a theory, it's the official record of Sean Diddy. Combs facing the most serious accusations of his life, not in the headlines but in front of a jury. From bizarre defense strategies and shocking messages to secret rehab admissions and the federal agent's raid on his hotel suite. This is the story of what happened, exactly how it happened, when Diddy finally had to answer for everything. Before a single word was spoken, the tone was already clear. This trial would be different. No phones, no cameras, no electronic devices allowed inside. Even seasoned journalists were scribbling by hand, racing to capture each moment as it happened. Among them was Matthew Russell, Lee from Inner City Press, the only consistent voice bringing updates to the outside world. His notes became the unofficial transcript, the only window into what was happening behind those heavy wooden doors. And on this particular day, the court gave Diddy's legal team a full schedule, cross-examination of Cassie until 4:30 p.m., followed by 30 minutes of redirect from the prosecution. The defense wasted no time, but they didn't start with questions. They started with strategy. Diddy's attorney, Estavillo, immediately challenged the prosecution's evidence, arguing over the admissibility of exhibits and a specific video. It wasn't just any video, it was Diddy himself walking in nature, talking about God. A video filmed while he was in a rehab facility in Sedona, Arizona. The defense argued it showed his spiritual journey. The prosecution countered it was a cheap trick to win jury sympathy. Worse, an attempt at jury nullification. The judge listened carefully, then with a slight nod, "Let's hear it." And just like that, the jury watched Diddy stroll through the desert, speaking softly about faith and redemption, while the charges looming over him painted a radically different picture. This was only the beginning. To the jury, it may have looked like a peaceful moment. Sean Combs, calm and reflective, walking through nature, talking about God. The video had been recorded during his time at a rehab facility in Sedona, Arizona, and the defense argued it was a key piece of evidence, showing personal growth, healing, and transformation. But prosecutors weren't buying it. To them, this wasn't rehabilitation. It was manipulation. They argued the video had nothing to do with the criminal conduct being examined. Worse, it was designed to appeal to the jury's emotions, not their judgment. A soft-spoken man talking about God in the middle of a trial involving allegations of rape, abuse, and coercion. To the prosecution, it was irrelevant. To the defense, it was everything. Their goal was clear: to show that Diddy had changed, that he had taken responsibility for past behavior, that he had gone through therapy, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. They even proposed playing parts of the video privately to Cassie through headphones in order to refresh her memory about his time in treatment. But the judge shut that down. No headphones, no sidebar memory games. Either the video came in for everyone or not at all. Prosecutors reminded the court that Cassie herself didn't even remember Diddy being in Sedona. He never mentioned it to her. There were no references. In text, no signs that it was ever a shared part of their story. It was a solo narrative, a curated image of Diddy as a man on a journey to healing. But in this courtroom, healing wasn't the question. Accountability was. And with that, the video played. The jury watched silently. It was a calculated risk by the defense. Whether it worked, only time would tell. But what came next would make that peaceful video feel like ancient history. Cassie took the stand, and everything changed. The courtroom settled. Eyes turned to the witness stand. Cassie, already under oath, faced Diddy's legal team head on. This wasn't her first time testifying, but this moment felt different. It was her words versus one of the most powerful men in the music industry, and the defense had a clear strategy, not just to challenge her story, but to dismantle it piece by piece. They opened with tone, trying to chip away at the language Cassie had used in earlier statements. "You said blacked out. What exactly did you mean?" Cassie clarified. "I said he was intoxicated." Everyone defines things differently. From the start, the defense focused on contradictions, real or perceived. They brought up texts. They questioned memories. They honed in on word choices. Then came a quote she had written in her own notes. "When you get effed up the wrong way." The defense jumped on it. "You meant drugs and alcohol, right?" She nodded, but the real bombshell wasn't the language. It was what came after the alleged violence. The defense showed the jury messages between Cassie and Diddy, texts that were flirty, even affectionate. This was the trap they were laying. If she had been abused, why was she still texting him like nothing happened? "I'm so horny for you," he wrote. The courtroom held its breath. "This isn't evidence," the prosecution snapped, objecting mid-exchange, but the damage was done. The messages were real, and now the jury had to reconcile two versions of Cassie: the victim and the woman who still engaged with her alleged abuser in the days after. She explained it the only way she could. "We needed a different vibe than Friday at the Intercontinental," she wrote back, referencing the now infamous hotel incident. Where video evidence showed Diddy assaulting her. Diddy replied, "For Friday, I don't even want to do that again." Whatever had happened that night, it was clear. They both remembered it. They both referenced it. But what those messages really meant would be for the jury to decide. And that was only the beginning. The courtroom shifted as the cross-examination took a darker turn, from awkward text to full-blown control and surveillance. Cassie described one moment with chilling clarity. They were in the car. Diddy told her to call her mother. She did, and in the middle of the call, he snatched her phone out of her hand. It wasn't just a stolen device. It was isolation, and it escalated fast. "He told me to call her to say I was okay," Cassie said. "When I unlocked the phone, he took it and ran down Wilshire Boulevard with her phone. He left her stranded. No way to call anyone. No way to leave. For hours she was cut off, until her mother, alarmed by the sudden silence, called the police." This wasn't a minor argument. This was a full-blown emergency. The prosecution used this moment to underscore a pattern: isolation, domination, and fear. But the defense pressed on. They asked what Diddy did with the phone. Cassie said she believed he went through it, possibly looking for messages tied to a suspected affair with an NFL player. "He was jealous," she said. "Always." Though she didn't name the athlete, the accusation was clear. Diddy's insecurity bled into surveillance. He had a habit of confiscating things, not just phones. "He took my car, my passport, my iPad," she recalled, anytime he got angry. To the jury, this painted a new kind of abuse, not just physical, logistical, strategic, controlling, and the pattern was repeating. When Cassie tried to assert independence, even in the smallest way, the response was immediate and aggressive. Still, the defense kept pushing, looking for cracks, looking for contradictions. But Cassie stood firm. The story wasn't just about one night, one fight, one act of violence. It was about a system of control that grew tighter with time. And what came next would show just how deep that control really went. As Cassie continued on the stand, the courtroom began to see a clear, disturbing pattern. Not just of violence, but of methodical psychological control. It started small. He'd take her phone after arguments. Then it escalated. Her passport, her iPad, even her car. Whenever she disobeyed him or challenged his authority, he'd strip her of something she needed. It was like punishment, Cassie said. But the punishment wasn't just about control, it was about dominance. Particularly when Diddy felt jealous, a feeling that seemed to haunt him constantly. He was especially paranoid about her relationships with men in the industry. One moment stuck out. He suspected Cassie was dancing with another artist, Chris Brown, at an event years earlier. She denied it. He didn't care. Every interaction Cassie had outside his orbit became a threat. She was forced to explain, to justify, to surrender privacy just to avoid confrontation. At times it turned violent. At others it was silent manipulation, but it was always present. Then came the question of rehab. Diddy's supposed journey toward healing. Cassie was asked why he went to Sedona, to get away from the drugs. She said vaguely, but the prosecution clarified that it wasn't just drugs. Diddy had sought treatment at a facility known for sex addiction therapy, not just substance abuse. And this wasn't hearsay. It was confirmed in records and statements. The same facility offered neurofeedback therapy and EMDR, treatments often used for PTSD and compulsive behavior. Cassie herself had undergone these therapies too, not for compulsion, but to heal from trauma. They hook you up to sensors and test your reactions, she explained. It helps reprocess memories to change how your brain sees trauma. That word, trauma, echoed throughout her testimony, and while the defense tried to paint her as inconsistent, emotionally confused, or even complicit. The portrait she painted was chillingly consistent, a relationship built on dominance, maintained through fear, and defended now with millions of dollars and top-tier lawyers. But no matter how much they tried to shift the focus, the trial kept circling back to the same question. What exactly happened behind closed doors? And the answer was about to get even more disturbing. The courtroom tensed as a new piece of evidence surfaced. Not a rumor, not a recollection, but an audio recording. This time the voice was Cassie's. Not crying, not pleading, but threatening. The context? A 2018 club appearance in Atlantic City, one of the few professional gigs she was allowed to do. Cassie had shown up to host, get paid, and go home. But instead, a man approached her with something sinister. "I saw your freak-off tape," he told her. According to the testimony, he claimed to have seen explicit footage of Cassie without her knowledge or consent. And Cassie snapped. In the recording played for the court, Cassie's voice is shaking. Not with fear, but with rage. "Yeah, you saw a video of someone effing me and you have it. Why didn't you show me? If you don't show me, I'll kill you, cut you up. I'm not playing." It was raw, unfiltered, pain turned violent. She didn't just threaten him. She said she'd have someone else do it so the blood wouldn't be on her hands. And while the prosecution clarified that nothing came of the threat, the moment spoke volumes. Cassie wasn't angry because someone had seen her naked. She was terrified that private footage, likely recorded during a freak-off, had been leaked, possibly without her consent. The man she threatened, identified as Sujit, replied meekly, "I'm not disrespectful, bro." He sounded unsure, possibly scared, and the jury heard it all. Cassie confirmed it was her voice. No attempt to deny, no excuse. But the real bombshell was what followed. She believed the leak had been caused not by Diddy, but by someone else in their circle, a man named Jonathan O.D. And this is where things started to tie together in ways no one expected. Because Jonathan O.D. wasn't just a background character. He was about to become a critical piece in a larger and far more dangerous puzzle. The courtroom leaned in as the name Jonathan O.D. resurfaced. A figure with connections that blurred the line between underground scandal and national headlines. Cassie testified that she believed Jonathan O.D., a known escort and alleged confidant of Diddy, may have secretly recorded one of the freak-offs. Those infamous group encounters that reportedly lasted for hours, sometimes days, and often left her physically wrecked. But Jonathan wasn't just a mysterious name from her past. He was the man who in 2018 opened fire inside Trump Tower and was arrested during a bizarre outburst that landed him in national news. And while in custody, he began talking. According to Cassie, that's when it all spilled out. Jonathan O.D. allegedly admitted to filming freak-off encounters without her knowledge and sharing those clips with others. Possibly even the man who had confronted her at the club in Atlantic City. Cassie feared the worst, she told Diddy. He said he'd take care of it, she recalled. But what did that mean? Was he trying to suppress the tape? Silence Jonathan? Pay someone off? One thing was certain. Cassie didn't trust him. Not Jonathan, not Diddy, not anyone close to those tapes. The courtroom was dead quiet as the prosecution walked the jury through. The implications: a video she didn't consent to, a known escort who might have filmed it, and a high-powered music mogul promising to make it disappear. The defense tried to steer the conversation back to Cassie's own actions. They implied she had reason to believe the video was consensual, or at least not unexpected. They even questioned her memory of when it was recorded, but it didn't work. Too many details aligned, too many silences from the people who should have protected her. And then, just as the court tried to absorb this revelation, another layer unfolded. This time involving two women who had haunted Cassie's relationship with Diddy from the start, Gina Nguyen and Kim Porter. The prosecution wasn't just building a case around abuse. They were showing how Diddy's control extended into every corner of Cassie's life, including who he allowed into it and who he didn't. Two names dominated this part of the cross-examination: Gina Nguyen and Kim Porter. Gina was more than just an ex. She was the woman Cassie found in a photo, lying next to Diddy, while she herself was staying at her parents' home in Connecticut. It was a quiet betrayal buried in pixels, And it broke something. It was the nail in the coffin, Cassie said. From that moment, she decided to leave. But Diddy didn't beg. He didn't threaten. Instead, he suggested couples counseling, a soft manipulation, master's concern. Kim Porter, however, was different. She wasn't just a former partner. She was the mother of 3 of Diddy's children and a constant presence in his life, especially during the holidays. Cassie testified that she was often excluded from these family events, even when Diddy would bring Kim along on vacations with the kids. Not just for the children, for her. He wouldn't. "Let me come," Cassie said. Sometimes he wouldn't even call me. It wasn't about parenting, it was about control. Cassie began to question her place in his life, especially when other mothers, like the one of his daughter Chance, weren't invited at all. And then came the most unsettling layer of all. Kim Porter's death in 2018. Kim was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The official cause was pneumonia, but to this day speculation lingers, and not just in gossip blogs. Cassie didn't suggest anything directly, but in a quiet, almost casual moment in court, a new name emerged: Corey Gamble. Yes, Kris Jenner's boyfriend, and yes, photographed at Kim Porter's house the morning she died, as EMTs and police swarmed the scene. The implication wasn't spelled out, but the room felt it. Why was he there? What was his connection? Cassie didn't know, but she said it out loud. She wanted Diddy to put her first. Above Kim, above Gina. Instead, he lied. "You lied to me," she texted him. She never went away. These weren't the words of someone obsessed. They were the words of someone erased, and then came the civil lawsuit. "He graped me after dinner in Malibu," she said under oath. The jury didn't flinch. No one moved. The tone of the trial had officially changed, because now the past wasn't just painful, it was criminal. As the trial pressed forward, the courtroom moved from memory to trauma, now from accusation to criminal allegation. Cassie recounted what happened in September of 2018, just after Diddy returned from Burning Man, the massive desert festival known for its chaos and hedonism. They went out for dinner at an Italian restaurant in Malibu. Something was off. He was acting strange, she told the court. Later that night, back at his place, Cassie says Diddy graped her. There was no shouting, no visible wounds, but what followed shattered her emotionally and would eventually push her toward legal action. The defense pressed on this point hard. They challenged her timeline. They brought up the fact that she continued to text him after the alleged assault, sometimes with affection, even warmth. They introduced messages like, "I don't want to freak off for the last time. I want it to be the first time for the rest of our lives." It was a painful contradiction, and they knew it. The defense was trying to undermine her credibility by pointing to these moments, as if affection meant consent, as if love invalidated trauma. But Cassie didn't back down. She explained that yes, she had feelings, that yes, she texted him, but those emotions were twisted by power, manipulation, and trauma bonding, the psychological glue that binds victims to their abusers. There were good moments, but they never lasted, she said. There'd always be a downswing. The prosecution asked, "What kind of world did Sean open you up to?" Cassie's voice broke. "A world of chaos," she said. And for the first time that day, she began to cry. Years of physical pain, years of psychological confusion, and now public scrutiny under oath. She described how she suffered chronic UTIs from the freak-offs, painful infections that left her immune to antibiotics, even when she got away. From him, her body was still fighting the aftermath. "I'm horny, just got over a UTI." She had texted him once. The message was shown in court, an eerie window into how deeply trauma had entangled itself with survival and routine, and when asked if she ever had consensual sex with Diddy again after the assault. Yes, the night her now husband accidentally FaceTimed her while she was still with Diddy. The courtroom was silent. This wasn't about clean storylines or easy conclusions. It was about control, manipulation, and fear, even in love. And what came next would shake that courtroom even harder. If Cassie's testimony had opened the door, what came next blew it off the hinges. The prosecution called their next witness Dawn Richard, a former member of Diddy's group, Al Dirty Money, and someone who had been inside the mansion, the studio, the inner circle. But today, she wasn't a performer. She was a witness to violence. The incident? 2009. At Diddy's Los Angeles home, Cassie and Dawn were both present. They were recording music. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. "Where the fuck is my food?" Diddy shouted. Without warning, he stormed into the room holding a black skillet filled with eggs, and according to Dawn, he tried to hit Cassie over the head with it. Cassie dropped to the ground, and it didn't end there. He kicked her in the head, kicked her in the body, then dragged her up the stairs. Dawn's voice was steady, but the courtroom was frozen. Glass broke. Cassie screamed, and Dawn, terrified, did nothing. "I was scared," she admitted, "for her and for me." The defense didn't deny Dawn's account, but they tried to. Poke holes. Why didn't she stop him? Why didn't she call the police? Her answer was simple and chilling. "Cassie told me not to talk about it," she said. "She said people could end up missing." Whether it was fear, loyalty, or trauma, Dawn stayed silent for years. But now, under oath, she had said the words out loud. And with that, the courtroom was forced to face a new reality. This wasn't just Cassie's story anymore. Someone else had seen it, felt the fear, heard the violence, and testified to it publicly. The prosecution didn't need to say much more. They had shifted the trial from he said, she said, to she said, and she saw. But they weren't finished yet, because the evidence wasn't only in memory, it was in photos, in hotel rooms, in plastic bags. And federal agents were about to take the stand with receipts in hand, just when the courtroom seemed to have reached its emotional limit. The prosecution called a new witness, someone who hadn't just heard about the violence, but had seen it with her own eyes. Dawn Richard, a former member of Diddy's musical group Dirty Money, stepped up to the stand. Known publicly for her time in the spotlight as a singer and performer, Dawn was now present for something much heavier, to testify about what she witnessed behind closed doors. Far away from the cameras, in a world where fame, fear, and silence often collided. The year was 2009. She and Cassie were at Diddy's home in Los Angeles working on music together. What should have been a creative, even celebratory environment quickly turned into something far more disturbing. According to Dawn, it started over something almost absurd, a missing meal. He walked in yelling, "Where the fuck is my food?" In his hands, Diddy was holding a black skillet filled with eggs, and before anyone could react, he swung it at Cassie, aiming for her head. Cassie dropped to the floor, curling into a fetal position on instinct, but the assault didn't end there. He started kicking her, Dawn said on the stand, her voice steady but unmistakably tense. Kicked her in the head, in the body, then dragged her upstairs by force, shouting, glass breaking, a terrified silence. Dawn did. Intervene. She didn't call the police, and when the defense asked why, her answer revealed the atmosphere of fear they all lived under. "Cassie told me it was better if we didn't talk about it," Dawn said. "She said people could go missing, whether it was a threat Cassie had heard from Diddy himself or something she'd come to believe after years in his orbit." The meaning was unmistakable. Silence wasn't just encouraged, it was a matter of survival. Dawn's testimony changed everything. This wasn't just Cassie standing alone anymore, trying to convince the jury with her memories. This was corroboration. Someone else had witnessed the violence, someone who had been there, someone who had kept quiet for years out of fear, and was only now breaking that silence under oath. The defense struggled to counter it. They could argue about timelines, about memory, about tone, but they couldn't argue with what was seen. And with that, the trial shifted again. It was no longer just a story of trauma described. It was a story of trauma witnessed. But if the jury thought they had heard the worst of it, they hadn't yet seen what federal agents had found when they raided Diddy's hotel suite. Because what was waiting in that room, in labeled bags and designer luggage, would only confirm that. Behind the luxury was something deeply twisted. Just as the emotional weight of live testimony was beginning to settle in the room, the prosecution took a sharp turn, from memories and witness accounts to something far more concrete: evidence seized during a federal raid. The courtroom quieted as Special Agent Yasin Binda took the stand, a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Human Trafficking and Crisis Negotiation Group. His presence marked a shift in the trial's focus, from what had been said to what had been found. Agent Binda had been part of the team that raided Diddy's hotel suite at the Park Hyatt, where the music mogul had been staying at the time of his arrest. His job was to photograph, catalog, and secure every item of interest. And what he described painted a disturbing picture, one that would haunt the jury long after the trial was over. Inside the suite, the agents discovered multiple plastic bags filled with personal items, but not the usual collection of clothes or toiletries one might expect. Instead, what they found was shockingly specific: dozens of bottles of Johnson & Johnson baby oil, stacked and stored like inventory, a large supply of Astroglide, a brand of personal lubricant, more bottles, more bags, discovered in the closet, in the bathroom, in the bedroom. The prosecution didn't need to speculate what these were used for. The connection to Cassie's repeated descriptions of freak-offs, prolonged, orchestrated sexual sessions that sometimes involved multiple participants and left her physically broken, was already well established. But then came something even more serious. In the Louis Vuitton bag found in the bedroom, agents discovered a prescription bottle, but not under Diddy's legal name. The name on the bottle? Frank Black. An alias that had already surfaced in court, one Diddy allegedly used when checking into hotels to host private sessions away from scrutiny. Inside that bottle were bags of pink powder, not cosmetic, not harmless. The powder was tested at a Customs and Border Protection laboratory, and the results were definitive: ketamine and MDMA. Two powerful psychoactive drugs often linked to both recreational use and, in some cases, coercive sexual scenarios. Then came the cash. Inside a black mini backpack, agents found $9,000 in cash, stacked and sealed. Agent Binder pulled the bills out one by one, fanning them for the jury to see. This wasn't just the celebrities' cluttered luggage. This was a travel-ready kit, prepped for control, sedation, and secrecy. The courtroom wasn't just hearing about freak-offs anymore. They were seeing the tools of the trade, laid out like an inventory list, straight from a federal raid. The defense tried to downplay it. They asked if there were signs that a woman had been staying in the suite, suggesting that maybe the items weren't just his, but the implication was clear. What Cassie had described for hours on the stand, what she had cried through under oath, now had physical weight. Plastic bottles, pseudonyms, powdered drugs. It was no longer a matter of belief. It was now a matter of evidence. And just when the jury thought this case couldn't go any deeper, another witness stepped forward. Someone who had been in the house. Someone who had survived the same nightmare. Because Cassie wasn't the only woman Diddy controlled. She wasn't even the only one who testified. As the courtroom adjusted to the shocking physical evidence uncovered during the raid, the prosecution turned to a crucial but often overlooked piece of the puzzle. Diddy's inner circle, the people who surrounded him day after day, many of whom enabled or endured the same patterns of control and abuse. That's where Mia comes. And she wasn't a celebrity, she wasn't a lover, she was an assistant, part of Diddy's professional entourage. And yet, what emerged from her involvement in this case was anything but professional. The name Mia is a pseudonym, a layer of protection ordered by the court to shield her identity, because Mia wasn't just a bystander in this story. She was a victim, and she was scheduled to testify later in the trial, but her presence was already being felt. Cassie explained how, during a period when she tried to cut ties with Diddy, blocking his number, ignoring his attempts to reach out, he still found a way in, through Mia. When I blocked him, he started contacting me through her. Cassie testified. It was subtle at first. Just messages passed along, casual requests, reminders, but over time it became clear that Mia wasn't just a conduit. She was part of the system, either coerced or complicit, caught in the web like so many others. And Mia's story wasn't just about passing messages. It was about what she endured herself. According to Cassie, she personally witnessed Diddy drag Mia out of bed and throw her onto a balcony. It wasn't a fight. It was an act of raw violence. Unprovoked, physical, and terrifying. Mia, like Cassie, didn't go to the police. She stayed, she worked, she endured. The court knew Mia would testify soon. Her moment was coming, but for now her name, even veiled, stood as a symbol of how deep the abuse ran. This wasn't just about one relationship gone wrong. It was about a culture of silence, maintained by fear and funded by fame. Assistants, musicians, employees, all of them had seen what went on behind the walls of mansions and private jets. Some had turned away, some had stayed loyal, and some, like Mia, were too scared to speak. Until now. With every layer the prosecution peeled back, the image of Sean Diddy Combs changed. He wasn't just a celebrity on stage. He was the man behind the curtain, pulling strings, shutting doors, and controlling everyone inside. But one of the darkest moments was still to come, because Cassie had more to say. About a flight, a sex tape, and a threat so personal it changed the course of everything, among all the disturbing moments revealed. During the trial, few carried the sheer psychological weight of the incident Cassie described on a transatlantic flight. A moment that underscored not only Diddy's obsession with control, but also the precise and chilling manner in which he wielded it. After attending the Cannes Film Festival, an event overflowing with glitz, press, and celebrity excess, Cassie had reached a breaking point. According to her testimony, she no longer felt safe, emotionally stable, or in control of her own body and mind. In a quiet act of resistance, she altered her travel plans, booking a commercial flight home instead of flying privately with Diddy. It was a decision made, perhaps, in the hope of creating physical distance, a brief moment of autonomy in a life where autonomy had been so systematically stripped away. But that brief hope collapsed as soon as she boarded the plane. Cassie looked up to find Diddy himself, seated beside her on the same flight. Not only had he discovered her change of plans, but he had taken steps to ensure she would not be able to leave quietly. The message was clear. No matter where she went, he could follow, and he would. What happened next was not loud or public, but it was devastating in its calculated cruelty. While sitting next to her mid-flight, Diddy pulled out his phone and began showing her a video. It was graphic, it was personal, and it was her, engaged in sexual acts with an escort. Cassie had never seen this recording before, nor did she recall giving permission for it to be made. She didn't know who else had seen it, but she knew in that moment that Diddy was using it for one reason: to trap her. Nay, upon landing in New York, the implied threat became explicit. Cassie testified that Diddy told her directly, unless she agreed to participate in another freak-off, the video would be released. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, terrifying ultimatum from a man who had built his empire not only on music and fame, but on secrecy, leverage, and fear. To the jury, this moment, taking place in a public setting on a plane surrounded by strangers, revealed the full extent of Diddy's manipulative reach. He didn't need to shout or resort to physical violence in that moment. He knew exactly how to break her down with precision, how to isolate her psychologically, even while sitting in a crowded cabin. This was not the impulsive rage of a jealous man. It was premeditated transactional coercion, a strategic act designed to reassert dominance over someone who was trying, in the smallest of ways, to escape. Cassie's choice to get on that commercial flight had been her way of reclaiming freedom. Diddy's presence beside her was a reminder that in his mind, she didn't have any. And as the courtroom sat in silence, the implications were impossible to ignore. What she experienced wasn't just abuse behind closed doors. It was a systematic campaign of control, one that followed her across oceans, through airports, into studios, and even into the air. Up next, the prosecution would push even further, asking Cassie to confront the hardest, most painful truth in front of the world. Did she ever doubt that what happened to her was rape? As the testimony reached its final stretch, the prosecution knew they had to return to the heart of the case, not just the pattern of control, not just the evidence of manipulation or the corroboration of violence, but the core of what this trial was fundamentally about: whether or not Cassie had been coerced, violated, and broken in ways that crossed the threshold of the law. And so they turned back to the night in Malibu, the night she said he raped her. The courtroom had already heard her description of that evening: the quiet dinner, the uneasiness, the shift in energy when they returned to Diddy's residence, and the moment when the man she had spent years trying to love and survive forced himself on her without consent. But now, standing at the edge of the trial's emotional cliff, the prosecution asked her the question that everyone in the room had been silently holding in their minds: do you believe he raped you? For a brief moment, Cassie didn't speak. She looked down, she took a breath that felt like it carried the weight of a decade. Yes, she finally said, her voice cracking. Yes, I do. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. raw, human. Then came another question, the kind that might sound cruel in any other setting, but that had to be asked in this one. Did you ever have sex with him again after that? Again, silence, Cassie. Nodded slowly, then whispered the answer, yes! And with that one word, the emotional floodgates opened. She wasn't sobbing uncontrollably. She wasn't trying to win sympathy. She was breaking down in the way people do when they've been forced to explain trauma to strangers, not just once, but repeatedly in front of lawyers, cameras, transcripts, and the man who caused it. This was the paradox the jury had been asked to understand, that a woman could be sexually violated and still return to her abuser. That she could continue a relationship, send affectionate texts, even say she loved him, and yet still be living through what survivors know as trauma bonding. It defies logic from the outside, but from the inside, it becomes a form of survival. The prosecution did not try to clean it up. They didn't attempt to simplify her answer. They let it sit there, complicated, painful, and deeply human. Cassie was then shown one final text. It had come months later, long after that night in Malibu, during a brief period of reconciliation. You'll make a beautiful mother one day, Diddy had written. It was a message that might have seemed loving, but in the context of what had happened, it felt more like a quiet form of ownership, a final attempt to remain embedded in her life, her body, and her future. Cassie responded with a simple request. I want closure. But as she told the courtroom, that closure never came. She never saw him again. And now, standing in court, with lawyers questioning her motives and the world watching, she was finally saying everything she had carried in silence for years. Not for revenge, not for headlines, but to reclaim the one thing she had been denied over and over again, the truth. As she stepped down from the witness stand, the room didn't erupt. There was no applause, no outbursts, just silence. The kind that only follows when something irreversible has been said out loud. But the case wasn't over, because while Cassie's testimony had shaken the courtroom, what came next would pull back the curtain on the people and institutions that helped cover it all up. If there was ever a moment in this trial where the balance began to tip, not just emotionally, but legally, it was when the courtroom turned its attention to a piece of evidence that had for years remained locked away from public view. The surveillance video from the Intercontinental Hotel. Until that point, much of the prosecution's case had relied on Cassie's testimony, witness accounts, and the deeply personal documentation of abuse. But now, the jury was confronted with something far more difficult to ignore: visual confirmation that what Cassie had been describing wasn't just believable, it was real. The footage came from a hallway camera quietly recording during the night of the now infamous assault. In it, you can see Diddy, visibly enraged, chasing Cassie down the corridor, grabbing her and throwing her to the ground with such force that she disappears from the frame. It's not long. It doesn't show everything, but it shows enough to prove violence, enough to prove intention, enough to expose a reality that couldn't be erased with denials or cross-examinations. But what made this video even more explosive wasn't just what it depicted, it was where it came from and how long it had been hidden. The footage had been recorded years earlier at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles, but for a long time, it never surfaced. According to the prosecution, the hotel had been aware of the incident shortly after it occurred. Staff had reviewed the tape, security had flagged the footage, and yet instead of contacting law enforcement or initiating any kind of response to a clear act of assault, the video was buried. Even more disturbing evidence in the case pointed to the possibility that the video wasn't just ignored, it may have been sold. According to internal sources, the footage ended up in private hands, negotiated behind closed doors, with the potential for blackmail or quiet payoffs always hovering in the background. Eventually, it became too toxic to contain. The video leaked through official channels, but through the media. And when it did, the public outcry was immediate. That brief, horrifying moment caught on camera became the undeniable proof that years of rumors and whispers had been leading to something far more serious than anyone had publicly admitted. Faced with mounting pressure, the Intercontinental Hotel reached a private settlement with Cassie. Reports confirmed the payout was in the range of $10 million, a figure that spoke less about generosity and more about guilt. They had known, they had seen, and instead of acting, they had looked away. For the jury, this wasn't just about what Diddy did. It was about the network of people and institutions that surrounded him. The ones who enabled, concealed, and when it suited their bottom line, paid to silence. Cassie's abuse wasn't just personal. It was institutional. A woman had been chased, attacked, and thrown to the floor in a luxury hotel. And the response had been nothing more than a transaction. By the time the section of the trial covering the Intercontinental incident concluded, it was clear Diddy hadn't acted alone. He may have carried out the violence, but others had helped him hide it, and the court hadn't even heard from everyone yet because more names were still to be called. More stories were waiting, and the public was beginning to ask the one question Diddy and his team could no longer escape. Who else knew? By this point in the trial, the jury had heard more than enough to understand that this wasn't just a story about a failed relationship or even about an abusive man. What had unfolded in that courtroom was the unraveling of a much larger, much darker truth, that Sean Diddy Combs had operated for years inside a carefully constructed bubble of protection, and that nearly every institution around him had at some point chosen silence over intervention. Cassie's testimony had laid the emotional foundation. Don Richard had corroborated the violence. The video from the Intercontinental had proven it beyond dispute. And the federal raid had confirmed the physical. Evidence of a lifestyle built around control, seduction, and fear. But there was still one question that echoed louder than the rest. How had he gotten away with it for so long? The answer, according to the prosecution, was simple: because people let him. The courtroom heard how Diddy had built a team of lawyers, assistants, bodyguards, and business partners, many of whom had either directly participated in or quietly cleaned up the messes left behind. These weren't just passive observers. They were active participants in a system that enabled abuse by shielding him from consequences. Text messages, emails, and financial records showed how non-disclosure agreements were routinely used to silence victims. Settlements were offered quickly before legal complaints could escalate. Witnesses were paid, coerced, or scared into submission. And for those who didn't comply, there was always the threat of professional blacklisting, being erased from the industry that had worked so hard to enter. One moment in the trial summed up this climate of fear perfectly. During her testimony, Cassie recalled a quiet conversation she once had with Don Richard after witnessing yet another violent outburst from Diddy. She had asked her if she was going to tell anyone. Dawn had shaken her head. "Let's not talk," she said. "People could go missing." Whether that was hyperbole or a reflection of real fear, the message was clear. Inside Diddy's world, speaking out wasn't just risky, it could be dangerous. And the culture of silence didn't stop at his immediate circle. Cassie described how, even at the peak of her suffering, she still had access to some of the biggest names in the music industry. Nicki Minaj, Lil Wayne, Rick Ross, all of whom she collaborated with under Diddy's watch. They saw her, they worked with her, but did they know what was happening behind closed doors? That question would linger long after the trial ended, because in the world Diddy controlled, image was everything, and the people who helped him maintain it, knowingly or not, had contributed to bearing years of abuse under awards, endorsements, and press tours. When the prosecution rested its case, there were no theatrics, no final slam of evidence, just a quiet understanding that everything that needed to be said had already been said, in sworn testimony, in seized evidence, and in the eyes of a woman who had carried her story alone for far too long. The court now prepared for closing arguments, but the public was already beginning to see what had really happened here. This wasn't just about one man's fault. It was about the cost of complicity. And the trial, even if it ended with a verdict, had only scratched the surface of a much larger story still unfolding. As the final hours of the trial approached, the courtroom settled into a strange kind of stillness, not the silence of suspense, but of reckoning. Everyone in that room, from the attorneys to the journalists scribbling notes by hand, knew that this case had already gone far beyond what anyone expected when the first complaint was filed. This was no longer just about Sean Diddy Combs and Cassie. It had become a mirror, one that forced the music industry, the legal system, and the public itself to confront the uncomfortable truth of how power shields itself, even in plain sight. The jury had heard enough to form their own conclusions. They had seen text messages that exposed manipulation masked as romance. They had watched footage of a violent hallway assault that was once buried and quietly settled. They had listened to Cassie recount moments of degradation so intimate, so disorienting, that even the most hardened legal professionals seemed shaken by their rawness. They had seen federal agents walk them through a carefully catalogued list of evidence: baby oil, pink powder, luxury bags, and aliases used to protect a man living two lives, one for the cameras and one behind closed doors. And now, as the attorneys prepared their closing arguments, it was clear that no matter the outcome of his trial, a verdict had already been delivered in the court of public conscience. Diddy had once stood as an icon of American success, a man who built a music empire from the ground up, turned street credibility into business empires, and became synonymous with the glamorous excess of hip-hop royalty. But through this trial, that image had been systematically dismantled, stripped down to something far more disturbing: a man who used his fame not just as a shield, but as a weapon. What's more haunting is how effective that shield was. For years, it worked. For years, it kept him untouchable, while the people around him either stayed silent, were silenced, or became collateral damage. The closing statements didn't aim to shock. They aimed to remind. The prosecution spoke not just of Cassie's courage, but of the broader implications, that if someone with her visibility, her access to lawyers and media and fans, could be isolated and terrorized for so long without intervention, then what hope is there for the countless others who suffer in silence without platforms, resources, or anyone to believe them? And the defense? They fell back on technicalities, inconsistencies in memory, out of context texts, a familiar playbook, questioning not the abuse, but the narrative, suggesting confusion, emotional volatility, mutual toxicity. But even as they spoke, something had changed. This was no longer just about what happened, it was about what we're willing to tolerate, and what justice really means when the accused holds all the money, all the lawyers, and all the connections. And yet, despite all the exposure, despite the mountains of evidence, the truth still hung in the air like something fragile. Because justice in court does not always mean justice in life. It doesn't reverse trauma, it doesn't erase what was done, and it certainly doesn't guarantee accountability for those who helped it happen. So now, as the trial ends and the world waits for verdicts, statements, settlements, the real question remains: what comes next? Will this case become a turning point, a moment that finally punctures the armor of celebrity invincibility, or will it fade into the background, replaced by the next scandal or the next distraction, the next album? For Cassie, the verdict may not matter as much as what she has already reclaimed, her voice. And for Diddy, no matter what judgment the court hands down, the world has already seen behind the curtain. The damage has been done, the silence has been broken, and nothing, not power, not fame, not money, will ever restore the myth that just came crashing down. When Cassie walked into that courtroom, she wasn't just walking into a legal battle, she was walking into a firestorm of judgment, headlines, and trauma that would be picked apart by strangers for months to come. But she did it anyway, because somewhere deep beneath the silence that had surrounded her for years, there was a voice that refused to stay buried, a truth that couldn't be negotiated away, and a line that once crossed would never let her go back to who she used to be. She wasn't perfect, she never claimed to be. Her story wasn't clean, and her choices, like so many survivors, didn't always make sense to the outside world. But she spoke, she showed up, and for the first time in years, the person with all the power wasn't the only one holding the microphone. Diddy's future remains uncertain. More lawsuits are coming, more witnesses may step forward, and behind the scenes, an industry that once protected its icons at all costs is beginning, just barely, to feel the heat of accountability. But no matter what happens next in the courts, the culture, or the headlines, one thing is now impossible to deny. The truth always finds a way to surface, even when it's buried under fame, even when it's hidden behind contracts, even when it takes years or koihiu or it's decades to rise. It comes back. And when it does, it doesn't whisper, it roars.